Lucretia Mott was a Quaker preacher and a pioneering reformer who became one of the most influential voices for justice in 19th-century America. Lucretia Mott, a tireless advocate for abolition and women's rights, was born Lucretia Coffin on January 3, 1793, on the island of Nantucket, Massachusetts. She came from a family of Quakers, a religious community known for their belief in equality and social justice. She had a quiet strength and moral conviction that would define her entire life. Mott's upbringing was shaped by the values of the Society of Friends, where women were permitted to speak in religious meetings and hold positions of spiritual authority. She was educated at Quaker schools where she developed her intellectual abilities and her commitment to equality. Then in 1809, at the age of 16, she met James Mott, a fellow teacher at the Nine Partners Quaker boarding school in New York. The two young educators fell in love and married in 1811. Lucretia Mott was a woman of principle who believed deeply in living according to her faith and her conscience. She had 6 children and raised them while simultaneously developing her voice as a minister and reformer. In 1821, when she was just 28 years old, Lucretia Mott became a recognized Quaker minister. She began to preach at Quaker meetings and her reputation as a powerful speaker grew throughout the region. Mott spoke with clarity and conviction about the moral issues of her day. In the 1820s and 1830s, she became increasingly involved in the abolitionist movement. The institution of slavery was the great moral crisis of 19th-century America, and Mott saw it as fundamentally incompatible with Christian values and human dignity. She joined the American Anti-Slavery Society and became one of its most effective advocates. Mott was not content to simply speak against slavery. She lived her principles, refusing to use cotton cloth or cane sugar or any products produced by slave labor. This commitment to what she called free produce was a form of economic protest against the slave system. In December 1833, Lucretia Mott helped found the Philadelphia Female Anti-Slavery Society. This organization brought together women of different races and backgrounds in the common cause of abolition. At a time when women had few political rights and were expected to remain in the domestic sphere, Mott and her fellow activists were asserting their right to participate in the great moral debates of their time. The Philadelphia Female Anti-Slavery Society organized petition drives, held public meetings, and raised funds for the abolitionist cause. Mott became a prominent figure in the movement, speaking at gatherings throughout the North. She faced considerable opposition and even violence. In 1838, when abolitionists gathered at Pennsylvania Hall in Philadelphia for the Anti-Slavery Convention of American Women, an angry mob attacked the building and burned it to the ground. Mott had been one of the main speakers at the convention. She refused to be intimidated by the violence and continued her work with even greater determination. Lucretia Mott was a brilliant orator who could move audiences with her words. She spoke without notes, drawing on her deep knowledge of scripture and her passionate commitment to justice. Her speeches combined religious conviction with practical arguments about human rights and social reform. She traveled extensively, speaking in churches, meeting halls, and private homes. Wherever she went, she challenged people to examine their consciences and to act against the evil of slavery. Mott believed that moral persuasion was the key to social change. She argued that if people truly understood the brutality and injustice of slavery, they would be compelled to oppose it. She described the suffering of enslaved people in vivid terms, making the abstract reality of slavery concrete and personal for her audiences. In June 1840, Lucretia Mott traveled to London to attend the World Anti-Slavery Convention. She was one of several women delegates from American abolitionist societies. When they arrived in London, however, the convention organizers refused to seat the women delegates. After heated debate, the male delegates voted to exclude women from full participation in the convention. The women were permitted to sit in a separate section behind a curtain where they could observe but not speak. Mott and the other women were outraged by this treatment. Among those who sat with Mott behind the curtain was a young woman named Elizabeth Cady Stanton. The two women formed a friendship that would change the course of American history. During their time in London, Mott and Stanton discussed the need for a movement to address the rights of women. They talked about organizing a convention focused specifically on women's rights. It would take 8 years for that vision to become reality. Lucretia Mott returned to America and continued her work for abolition and social reform. She and her husband James were active in the Underground Railroad, providing shelter and assistance to freedom seekers escaping from slavery. Their home in Philadelphia became a station on the network that helped thousands of enslaved people reach freedom in the North and in Canada. Mott worked closely with other abolitionists, both black and white, including Frederick Douglass, William Lloyd Garrison, and Sojourner Truth. She believed in the importance of interracial cooperation in the fight against slavery. At a time when American society was deeply segregated, Mott insisted on the full equality and humanity of all people regardless of race. In July 1848, Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton finally organized the convention they had discussed in London 8 years earlier. The Seneca Falls Convention was held in upstate New York and brought together approximately 300 people to discuss the social, civil, and religious rights of women. Mott was one of the primary organizers and speakers at the convention. The gathering produced the Declaration of Sentiments, a document modeled on the Declaration of Independence that outlined the ways in which women were denied equality in American society. The Declaration stated that all men and women are created equal and listed 18 grievances against the treatment of women. These included the denial of the right to vote, the lack of property rights for married women, limited educational and employment opportunities, and the exclusion of women from most professions and positions of authority. The Seneca Falls Convention marked the beginning of the organized women's rights movement in America. Lucretia Mott was 55 years old and already a veteran reformer with decades of experience in public advocacy. She brought to the women's rights movement the same moral conviction and strategic thinking that had made her an effective abolitionist. Mott understood that the struggle for women's rights was connected to the struggle for abolition. Both movements were based on the fundamental principle that all human beings possess equal rights and dignity. She argued that the same arguments used to justify slavery, that certain groups of people were naturally inferior and suited only for subordinate roles, were also used to justify the subordination of women. Following the Seneca Falls Convention, Lucretia Mott continued to speak and organize for both abolition and women's rights. She helped establish the American Equal Rights Association in 1866, an organization dedicated to securing equal rights for all citizens regardless of race or sex. Mott served as president of the organization and worked to build bridges between the women's rights movement and the movement for racial justice. She believed that these causes were inseparable and that true equality required addressing both forms of oppression simultaneously. However, the relationship between the women's rights movement and the abolitionist movement became strained in the years following the Civil War. When the 15th Amendment was proposed to grant voting rights to black men but not to women, the women's rights movement split over whether to support the amendment. Lucretia Mott was deeply troubled by this division. She supported the 15th Amendment even though it did not include women, believing that it was an important step toward racial justice that should not be opposed. She argued for patience and continued advocacy for women's suffrage while supporting the immediate extension of voting rights to black men. This position put her at odds with some of her longtime allies in the women's rights movement, including Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, who opposed the 15th Amendment because it excluded women. Mott tried to maintain unity and to keep the focus on the broader goals of equality and justice. She urged her fellow reformers not to let disagreement over strategy destroy the movements they had built together over decades of work. Throughout her long career, Lucretia Mott remained committed to nonviolence and moral persuasion as the tools of social change. She was a pacifist who opposed all forms of violence, including war and violent resistance to oppression. During the Civil War, she supported the Union cause and the goal of ending slavery, but she grieved over the terrible loss of life and hoped for a peaceful resolution to the conflict. After the war ended in 1865, Mott focused her efforts on reconciliation and on ensuring that the promises of freedom and equality would be fulfilled for the formerly enslaved people. She continued to speak out against racial discrimination and to advocate for full civil rights for African Americans. Lucretia Mott was also a champion of other reform causes. She supported temperance, believing that alcohol abuse contributed to poverty and domestic violence. She advocated for prison reform and more humane treatment of criminals. She called for improvements in education and for greater access to learning for all people. She supported the peace movement and worked for international cooperation and the peaceful resolution of conflicts. Mott saw all of these causes as connected by common principles of human dignity, compassion, and justice. She believed that society could be transformed through moral awakening and that individuals had a responsibility to work for the common good. In her personal life, Lucretia Mott was known for her warmth, her wit, and her generous hospitality. Her home was a gathering place for reformers, intellectuals, and seekers of justice from around the world. She and James Mott had a partnership based on mutual respect and shared values. James supported his wife's public work and often traveled with her to conventions and speaking engagements. He managed their household and business affairs so that Lucretia could dedicate her time to advocacy and ministry. Their marriage was a model of equality and cooperation at a time when married women had few legal rights and were expected to be subordinate to their husbands. Lucretia Mott continued her work well into her 70s and 80s. She remained active in the women's rights movement and attended conventions and meetings whenever her health permitted. In 1878, at the age of 85, she attended the 30th anniversary celebration of the Seneca Falls Convention. She spoke to the gathering about the progress that had been made and the work that still remained to be done. Mott acknowledged that the goals of the women's rights movement had not been fully achieved, but she expressed confidence that future generations would continue the struggle and eventually secure full equality for women. She encouraged younger activists to persevere and to maintain their commitment to justice even in the face of setbacks and opposition. On November 11, 1880, Lucretia Mott died at her home near Philadelphia. She was 87 years old and had devoted more than 60 years of her life to the causes of abolition, women's rights, and social reform. Her death was mourned by reformers across the country and around the world. Memorial services were held in Philadelphia and other cities, and speakers paid tribute to her courage, her integrity, and her unwavering commitment to justice. Frederick Douglass, the great abolitionist leader and orator, spoke at her memorial service and praised her as one of the most important reformers of the 19th century. He recalled her kindness to him when he was a young man just beginning his work in the abolitionist movement and her steadfast support for racial equality throughout her life. Lucretia Mott left behind a legacy that extended far beyond her own lifetime. She helped to launch the organized women's rights movement in America and inspired generations of activists who continued the fight for equality. The Seneca Falls Convention that she helped organize is recognized as a pivotal moment in American history, the beginning of a movement that would eventually secure voting rights and legal equality for women. Mott's work for abolition contributed to the end of slavery and to the expansion of civil rights for African Americans. Her advocacy for peace, education, and social justice influenced countless other reform movements. What made Lucretia Mott such an effective reformer was her ability to combine moral conviction with practical strategy. She was deeply religious and saw her activism as an expression of her faith, but she also understood how to organize, how to build coalitions, and how to communicate effectively with diverse audiences. She was willing to work with people who disagreed with her on some issues if they shared common goals on others. She built bridges across lines of race, religion, and ideology. Mott was also remarkable for her consistency. She lived according to the principles she preached, refusing to compromise her values even when it would have been easier or more profitable to do so. Her refusal to use products made by slave labor was just one example of her commitment to making her daily life consistent with her beliefs. Lucretia Mott understood that social change is a long process that requires patience, persistence, and courage. She knew that she would not live to see all of her goals achieved, but she believed that each generation had a responsibility to advance the cause of justice as far as it could. She encouraged her fellow reformers to think in terms of decades and generations rather than months and years. She reminded them that the arc of history bends toward justice but only through the sustained efforts of people committed to making it so. Mott was willing to endure criticism, opposition, and even violence because she believed that the causes she served were more important than her own comfort or safety. In the history of American reform movements, Lucretia Mott stands as one of the most important and influential figures. She was a pioneer who helped to create new possibilities for women's participation in public life. She was a moral leader who called America to live up to its founding ideals of liberty and equality. She was a bridge builder who worked to unite different movements and different communities in common cause. She was a woman of faith who saw the divine image in every human being and who dedicated her life to defending the dignity and rights of all people. Lucretia Mott's life reminds us that ordinary individuals can make extraordinary contributions to social progress through courage, conviction, and sustained commitment to justice.